Hello again, everybody, and welcome to the second video on EFL Methods. And this is where we'll take a journey of sorts and take a look at a brief history of where we got to where we are today when we think about methods. And so here to begin, we're going to look at what is called a linguistic method. And maybe the most basic linguistic method is one I believe we're all familiar with, and it's the grammar translation. Now, as a part of the preparation for our first session together, I'm going to want you to take a text in your language and translate it into English. Now, it's not exactly how this method was used in the classroom at the beginning, but let's take a look at the grammar translation method. It was begun in classical education. So for nearly 200 years in Western civilization, this idea of learning a foreign language, not one of a neighboring country that they're using now, but learning the classics. And so you think of Plato, you think of Socrates, you think of these great works of the past. It was built into the curriculum that students would learn those ancient languages by translating those languages into their first language. And you could do some back and forth. But really you can see a high focus on learning vocabulary by memorizing, learning grammar by memorizing, and then sitting quietly at your desk and translating one text from an ancient language into their current language, and just working through that back and forth. So I hope that you enjoyed a little bit of that translation work and give you a taste practically of what that is like. So this really begins to set the stage that you see foreign languages being taught in schools pretty early on in the way that we think of schools today, but that has continued to evolve. And so you have here three different methods that are natural methods. Translating is maybe unnatural when you think of using a language, so different educators started to develop new methods and new ways of teaching language, and not just the classics, but actual languages that we would use today. French, English, Spanish, German. How do you teach those languages in the classroom? Because schools held on to the belief that learning languages are important, but maybe we need to move beyond the classics into practical languages. And so how do children learn their first language? That's what you would consider a natural method. This idea of discovering how do humans learn language in a natural way as children, how can we translate that into how they would learn in the classroom when they're a little bit older? So let's begin here with the direct method. Maximilian Berlitz was a German educator living in the United States in the late 1800s. You can see into the early 1900s. And as a teacher, he was teaching French in a classroom. He got sick. And when he was sick, it was bad. He was absent for 6 weeks, and he needed to find a substitute teacher that could come in and continue to teach his classes until he was able to come back. So he quickly found a young French teacher named Nicolas Joly. And Nicolas Joly agreed, came into the classroom. Berlitz gave him the curriculum. He began to teach the students. After 6 weeks, Berlitz came back into the classroom and was amazed at the progress that his students had made in that short amount of time. And what he found out was that Monsieur Joly, this new substitute teacher, only spoke French. He didn't speak English. He didn't speak all of these students' first language. And so from the beginning and the whole time, the only language that these students learned and heard and practiced with in the classroom was French, was this language that they were trying to teach. And so Mr. Berlitz thought about the method of only using the second language and began to develop what is considered now the direct method, where a teacher would give a phrase, a teacher would give an expression. There's a high focus on speaking and listening and repeating and having conversations with a little bit of movement, teaching new vocabulary little by little, but all of a sudden, through Mr. Berlitz's illness, a new method began to develop, which we now know as the direct method or the Berlitz method, and a strong emphasis moving from the page and translation to listening and speaking. Now, the second natural method is called the audiolingual method and is very similar to the direct method, but a little bit different. So a little bit later, in the mid-1900s, throughout the world, you have what is known to all of us as World War II. And in World War II, these governments, these nations are having to interact with one another in war. Some are friends and have to use different languages as all these different countries are fighting on the same side or against each other, and you have to train spies in order to communicate well with the enemy. And so the U.S. government devised a method of learning language called the audiolingual method that really only focused on learning conversations perfectly by heart, with perfect pronunciation, with perfect accent. They didn't worry about reading and writing, but making spies, which you can see in this book. It's written about a true female spy from the United States during this time, and they would mimic. They would listen to authentic language and then mimic over and over and over and repeat phrases until their mouths and their tongues were able to move perfectly, just like that second language. So interesting story on the audiolingual. Now the third is total physical response, TPR. I think most of us have heard of TPR before. Moving a little bit further into the 1970s, James Asher was also trying to think, how do children learn? And children often learn by a long silent period in their lives where they listen to the language and then they act. So we know that children understand the language because they respond in the appropriate ways. You can say, get up and turn the light off. And when they get up and turn the light off, we realize they know the language at least well enough to go and do it. They understand it. So there's this silent period where students would learn the language by listening and by doing and have a complete total physical response to the language. And then as they become more and more comfortable, then they start speaking themselves. And so these are natural ways of learning language that developed into methodologies that teachers would use in the classroom. Now, moving beyond linguistics, beyond natural methods, here we have a couple examples of visionaries. These are educators who would think outside the box and had different ideas that would drive them to think about the human brain, how we learn, and how that could translate into a foreign language classroom. The first one here is called the silent way. This is a little bit different than the silent period that we see in TPR. The silent way, developed by Caleb Gattagno in the 1960s, he was not a language professional. He was more of a mathematician, and in his own studies, he came to believe that in order to truly retain new information, in order to truly know something in a way that you can use it in a lot of different settings, in order to get to that deep level of learning, there had to be struggle. And so he translated that into education and into foreign language education to say, what's the most minimum amount of language that I can give the students? So a teacher would give students a minimum amount of language, and then through props, through showing them something physical, he would get them to begin to use that language in a problem-solving way. And so the idea with the silent method is to give a little bit of language, through the use of props, not speaking of the teacher, but showing something, you create a problem that the students know, now I need to use the language in order to solve a problem, and the teacher just sits back and literally is silent. That's why it's called the silent way. And the teacher would watch and observe the students struggle and problem solve and help each other and try to put the language together in a specific way in order to solve the problem and begin to communicate or continue to communicate. And through these series of problem-solving challenges, the teacher guides the learning. And so, is this effective? I don't know. You'll take a look at it in the book and look at it a little bit more closely. But I think one of the major key themes that we can learn from this visionary way of thinking of learning language is, as teachers, do we talk too much? And how much of our classroom time should we step back, create problem-solving opportunities, and be silent and let our students really struggle with the language to where they don't just memorize it, but they learn it for themselves through a process of growth and problem-solving. So, the silent way. The second visionary is Georgy Lozanov. And this was developed into the 1970s and 1980s. And again, Lozanov was not originally a language expert. He was not an educator. But he was a psychologist, psychiatrist, and really was fascinated with the brain. How do human brains function? How do human brains learn? And he began to develop in his own work this idea of accelerated learning. And so, not just in the classroom, but in life, how can we help people, humans, accelerate their learning and learn more? He believed that the brain had an immense capacity for learning. And so within this method that was known as Suggestopedia or Desuggestopedia, what Lozanov is trying to figure out is, how do we bring people or how do we bring students into a new environment that really allows their brain to be as open as possible to learning, as stress-free as possible to learning. And so he was trying to manipulate a classroom by using music, by having the students take on new names and new identities, by having seating that was comfortable so that in a way they would go to a new world or a new place where they felt safe. And all of a sudden, as the stress would go down, then their brain capacity would go up. And within that environment, they would actually work really, really hard and supposedly learn up to 1,000 new vocabulary words each hour. But this is definitely a method and a way of thinking about students and as humans and how do they learn, and creating a method and a situation in which they can learn the best. So really, what I think one of the major components that we can learn from Desuggestopedia is how can we create a learning environment for our students that is most conducive for them to relieve stress and really focus on learning the language without fear of failure. I like both of those visionary leaders, especially Desuggestopedia. And then finally, we get to the communicative methods, and the one that maybe we are most familiar with, I know that this is the one that I'm most familiar with and that our school has adopted, is called the communicative language teaching. And this method, a lot of people actually say, is the first to go beyond methods. And so you might choose TPR as a specific method, and it has a way to train teachers to teach in that specific methodology, or Desuggestopedia. These are the things, and there are schools that you can go to specifically learn how to teach in that one method. But here, within the communicative language method, in a way we are moving beyond one method and saying, why are we learning a foreign language? Well, it's in order to communicate, whether that's through spoken language, through written language, through all of the skills. And so we begin to teach and develop curriculum based on how can I help these students communicate effectively in all these different situations. And so you start asking the question like, when do I speak and when do I be quiet? When I speak, how do I do it? Do I speak politely if I'm talking with a teacher or a professor or a boss? Or do I use slang if I'm talking with my friends? How do I interrupt when I'm in the middle of a conversation? How do I interrupt politely? And so all of these ideas of communicative competence are now leading the way in how we would teach language. How do we write an email? How do we write a book? Those are two different ways of communicating, of writing. How do I write a text? And so communicative language teaching moves beyond just learning a language, but thinking about the purposes for which our students are learning that language. All right, so now we're finished. We've taken a brief overview of these 7 methods. You will now read chapter 2 in Brown's book, and you'll see these 7 methods among a few others in that. And then you'll have some videos here. The links I will email to you or put on Blackboard so that you can watch each of these 7 methods that are being practiced in a classroom and add to it. And I look forward to our time together and really diving into these 7 a little bit more deeply. Thank you.